Good evening, everybody. My name is Aaron, and I will be your guest host for this evening's webinar, stepping in for Dave Winfield. So I do apologise that if you were looking forward to seeing Dave, you've got me instead on our webinar on equality, diversity, and inclusion on behalf of the Independent Schools Portal. Just in terms of introductions, this is our second of our free webinars this year after the Keeping Children Safe in Education update in September. And all of these webinars, as always, are sponsored by Brightcore Consultancy, a mental health and safeguarding consultancy. Thanks to Brightcore's generous support, we're able to make these webinars completely free of charge. And I'll now pass you over to Ollie Wellesby, the founder and lead consultant at Brightcore, to say a few words and share a little bit more information with yourselves.
Thanks, Aaron, and good evening, everybody. My name's Ollie Wellesby. I'm the lead consultant at Brightcore. I know I've spoken to some of you before. In fact, we work with quite a few of you as well, looking at those of you who signed up to the webinar this evening. And I actually presented the one on safeguarding just a few months ago, or it feels like a lifetime ago now, doesn't it, in the education world. For those of you that I haven't met before or haven't come across Brightcore, we are a specialist organisation that works with schools and colleges nationwide and businesses that work with children as well to support safeguarding and mental health and wellbeing. And we work with just under 1,000 schools, colleges and organisations now to support them in both of those areas. Our main remit as an organisation, all being former education leaders ourselves, is to try and provide sort of high quality, cost effective training and support where we all knew what we wanted when we were in schools. So that's kind of our remit and our ethos. This isn't a sales pitch. I'm just pleased we're able to sponsor such a fantastic program, and Audrey to be able to speak to you tonight as a fantastic speaker as well. Really looking forward to hearing that. We'll send you a link over, those of you who subscribe to tonight, we'll send you a link over the next couple of days just to see if you want to sign up to one of our newsletters where we share lots of information and resources as well. Please don't feel obliged though. As I said, it's really just our way of trying to support and get information out there as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand back to Aaron now, and I hope you enjoy tonight's fantastic webinar.
Great, thanks, Ollie. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Audrey Pantelis. Audrey is a former head who is now one of the UK's foremost experts in helping schools understand how they can embrace equality, diversity and inclusion, and what this means in practice and how it can have a positive impact on your whole school community. Whilst Audrey is speaking, I'll keep an eye on the chat box, and once it's finished, if there's any time, I'll ask any questions, but feel free to jump into the chat box and ask any questions. So without further ado, Audrey, it's over to you.
Thank you so much, Aaron, and thank you, Ollie, and good evening to you all. I'm just getting my screen ready now as we get started. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you, and I have to say, with envy, somebody was just having a lovely little glug of wine there, and I have to say, there was a little part of me thinking, I wouldn't mind joining you right now, but how unprofessional would that be? So I'm going to have to just look on in envy, but with absolute pleasure and not too much envy, I'm going to be able to get started with our webinar this evening. And I want you all to notice the deliberate mistake that was definitely a mistake on my part. Tonight's webinar is called According to Your Good Selves, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, an introduction. And when I was speaking with Alicia way back when we planned this, I would have said to her equity, and I'll talk a little bit about the differences between those words. And she's used the word equality, but I should have checked that, and it's actually equity, and you'll see why as we proceed through this next 60 minutes or so. But yeah, this is what we're going to be talking about this evening, and hopefully by the end of it, any questions, by all means pick them up, put them in the chat, and Aaron will sort those out, and I will hopefully answer them. However, of course, if it gets to the point where we run out of time and we haven't got time for questions, then there'll be an opportunity for you to be able to contact me, and I'm happy to do them offline as well. So let's get started and let's get into it. Just a little bit of background as to who I am. Aaron's already introduced me. My main job, the fundamental job that I do is I'm a diversity, equity and inclusion trainer, facilitator and speaker. The reason why I do that now is for the last 5 years, I've got my own company and I've been doing this work predominantly in schools, although I do work with organisations now as well, in helping them understand schools and organisations, their DEI journey, understanding the relevance of what diversity, equity and inclusion means. And it's interesting because everyone's got a different idea of it, and everyone's context is different, and I think that's the joy of what I do. I enjoy going into schools and working out what people need and then supporting them in that. And the reason why, of course, I love being in schools is because I'm an educator at heart. I'm a former head of school, and I was lucky enough to be the founding head of a brand new free special needs school based in northwest London. But prior to that, I have spent my life, my career, I've only done one job, and that's just been in education. And I started off as an unqualified teacher and worked my way up through those different ranks as you do. And I've worked in mainstream and I've also worked in special needs. And so I've had a real breadth of experience over the past 30 something years. I don't put that now on because I didn't like to look at the word 30 because it just seemed like a very large number. Let's just say I've done a couple of rounds. And so I kind of know the score. I've also worked as a former chair of governors, and I was not only a chair of governors for it's actually a charity that ran two special needs schools, working predominantly with children with autism, but I've also been a governor as well. And so the governance side is now familiar to me. So I'm aware of kind of what the needs are from a different range of perspectives. And on top of that, as if I didn't have anything else to do, I'm also a leadership coach as well. So I work with, I'm not specifically leaders, but especially in the school sector, because I do work with people who are not in schools, but from a school perspective, I work, with leaders and senior leaders and senior leadership teams as well. So that's just a little bit about who I am and what I do. So I'm very well versed from where the majority of you are coming from this evening, understanding that it looks different in each school, but most schools have the same kind of characteristics, and it's important that we think about it from a contextual point of view, but also recognizing that if we are good as the staff and leaders, then it means that the children that we serve, the young people that we serve, we are effectively creating them and helping them to be the best adults that they can be. And so in today's session, what we're going to do, we're going to unpack some things. I might give you some challenge to a certain extent, not too much because we've only got an hour, but and things to consider. And as I've said, if you want to have any questions, do put them into the chat. But if you find that we've run out of time, then there's an opportunity for you to get in touch with me and we can have an offline conversation. So what do we know when we're thinking about equality or equity, diversity and inclusion? Well, let's start with some basics. Let's start thinking about probably something that we should know, and we probably do already know it, but possibly it doesn't always get that kind of spotlight as it should. The diagram that you can see on the slide now, that you can see on the screen, are the 9 protected characteristics of the Equality Act. So the Equality Act, if you like, is the foundation of, in this country, in the UK, that is, of how we view, if you like, equity, diversity and inclusion. And it is based upon these 9 characteristics, protected characteristics. What's really interesting, and what I find really interesting, is the idea that sometimes when we're talking about protected characteristics, we seem to focus on just 2 or 3, and that isn't the case, in the fact that we shouldn't only just be thinking about race. We shouldn't only just be thinking about disability. We shouldn't only just be thinking about sexual orientation. And you'll find in most schools, quite a number of schools, that's what tends to happen. What we need to remember is that there are 9, there are a range. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. But these 9 are based in law. set up by the last Labour government back in 2010. It was the result of a number of protected characteristics, discrimination acts, if you like, that were brought together under one act. And those different discrimination acts, had been built upon, and added to the statute books over the last 50, 60 years, possibly even longer. But in 2010, they all came under one, and it was then called the Equality Act. And again, I'll talk about the language and why it was called that then. And why we might, if we were to do it again now, why we would possibly give it a different name. Interestingly as well, since these 9 have been established, sometimes there are calls for people to think, well, there should be other protected characteristics put in place as well. And that's open for debate. And, at the moment, we don't have anything else. This is all we have. So this is what we're going for at this time. And it's these that the law protects. It's these protected characteristics that the law will look out for. And you have to be 13 years or older to be covered by the protected characteristics, because that's how the law works. So this means that for those of you that work in, senior schools, this impacts your young people as well. And I'm sure it's probably taught as part of your PSC or PSHE program. But just to know that actually this covers all people from the age of 13 and above. So when we're thinking about equality, diversity and inclusion, or as we should rightly say, equity, diversity and inclusion, we're thinking about it with the protected characteristics in mind. So when we're now having a think about those 3 key words, I thought it would be helpful just to make sure that we've kind of got a nice and clear understanding of the definitions of these words, these key words. And so I start with diversity, because you'll also notice that in some settings, they will call it diversity, equity and inclusion. Now, there is no right or wrong. There's nothing, if you decide to call it DEI in your school or your setting, that's fine, because there's no rank order. It simply means you choose to put diversity first because maybe that's the most important of those 3 words to you. Some schools or some settings like to have equity first, absolutely fine. Some people like to call it DE and I, absolutely fine. So don't get hung up too much about the order in which you put these words. It's contextual. It doesn't mean anything as far as I'm aware. So with regards to diversity, every time I think about diversity, and you've got the image there of the lovely children there, all smiling, and I always have this image of the photographer either holding up something, or probably potential, a nice little bribe there of you will get, these sweets as soon as you finish taking this, or maybe they've been told to say sausages, who knows? But the reality is they're all smiling, but what you're seeing is a range of children there, all looking wonderfully joyous and jubilant, and they all look different, because when we're thinking about diversity, we're talking about the power of difference. Each of these young people are going to grow up to be adults, and they're all going to bring something different to the world, and that's what we want. We want the power of difference. We want the different and unique takes that these young children, that the world, that we all are. Because that's how we're designed. That's how that's how the world is. And we've spent a long time, haven't we? If you think back to possibly either when you were at school, and even as, a teacher and educator in schools now, we love it when our children are compliant and all do the same thing. We absolutely love it. And yet, actually, we should be embracing the differences. And it's becoming more apparent now as we leave that idea of compliance and being identikit children and being identikit adults even. We're desperately now trying to assert ourselves as being authentic. And it's not easy when we've created a world where we like compliance. There's nothing wrong with compliance. There's nothing wrong with getting things right. There's nothing wrong with being safe. But we really need to kind of push forward the value of diversity, that power of difference, knowing that we're all bringing different thoughts, different looks, different ideas, different perceptions into the mix. Because actually that's what makes us stronger. Our differences make us stronger. So when I think about diversity, I always think about the power of difference. So here we're now going into our semantics lesson. We're getting into the language, and you can now see why I call it equity as opposed to equality. So let me go back in time a little bit. When we're thinking about the word equality, and for those of you that have been in education for a little while, you'll remember the equal ops questions that you used to get in the interviews, and there was equal ops, which was a thing. For those of you that just joined education and just been a teacher for the last few years, you won't know what I'm talking about. But before, when we used to talk about equality and when we used to talk about giving people opportunities to do things, it was very much like the first image that you can see on the screen there. So the idea was, and schools have been and always will be probably very good at this, because within our communities, we were always about opportunities. And we see this when we differentiate our work, for example. So you can see there in that first image, we've got 3 people of different statures, and they're all trying to see the game. And of course, we can see that they've all been given the same height of the box, nice and clear, and so we can see how it's impacting those 3 people of different statures, with the first person who is fairly tall and is being able to see the game beautifully with the same box, the middle person who can see the box is helping them, but the person who's got the same box cannot see over the fence at all, and they're just about looking through the crack. They can just about see it. And so as a result of that, even though equality has been good, and we can see this when we think about it from an educational point of view. For example, when we do school trips, when we apply that subsidy, for example, and we think to ourselves, yeah, that's great, we're going to make everybody pay a reduced fee because the school will subsidise it, and we're putting in that same amount. We're thinking that's helpful. But as you can see, not everybody is going to be able to get the benefit of that. That's what we can see. Even though we're doing a good thing. So equality is kind of where we were and what we were doing for quite a long time. And we were quite happy with that. We felt that that was kind of a good thing. It was something that was good to do, and it was helpful. But actually, as we can see, not always totally helpful. So the reason why, and literally this has been, I would say, in the last 5, 6, 7 years or so, we've moved away from equality, and we're now thinking very much more about equity, which is why I was talking about that at the very beginning of the session there, is that we believe when we're thinking about equity, it's the idea that we're giving people exactly what they need in order to thrive. And so you can see the difference between equality and equity with the first person in the middle image who doesn't need any support. So they're not getting any support, and they're still able to see, and it's great. And the middle person who needed some support is still receiving that support, and they're able to see. And then the last person who needed extra support is getting the extra support with the 2 different stances, and they're enabling their view of the game as well. And so you can see those differences. And we used to sometimes think, well, it's not very fair, is it? Because the first person isn't getting anything, but they don't need anything. And I wonder whether that shift away from equality into equity, definitely, I think, is a bit of a remnant from, and not even necessarily a remnant, just different ways of thinking. If you think about what we've gone through with regards to COVID-19 and the pandemic, we've really had to think about the input because it's had such a massive impact on all of us. And so we're very sensitive to that now. We're very mindful of that. And so that's why now we think about equity. So it's giving people exactly what they need in order to thrive. When we look at the last image, of course, And you may well have seen these two images before. The third image is really interesting in the simple fact that ideally, in an ideal world, there will be a time when we don't need to give anybody any support, because actually the barriers for people to thrive will no longer be there, and hence it's been labelled liberation. So I like to always put that there because it's just a reminder of what we aspire to. Whether we get there, whether I'll get there in my lifetime, who knows? But that's what we're looking for. So in the meantime, we focus on equity. And that's the reason why I no longer use the word equality and I use the word equity. So if you see now equality written down in any of your documents at school, you might want to point it out and just say you learned something very useful at a webinar in November, and you would like now maybe to think about changing the word equality to equity. When we're thinking about the word inclusion, we're thinking about the idea that everyone's voice is heard, regardless of what it looks like. So you can see from the image there on the slide that we're focusing on, in this case, it's just showing and highlighting it and being illustrated by the hands and the different shades of the skin that we can see there. But inclusion, we're talking about it from, remember, from the protected characteristics point of view. So we've got the different ranges of people there, different voices being heard, and making sure we're not leaving people out. We can all remember what it feels like when we are left out. We all know how that feels. I think children remember it a lot, and I don't think it changes when we become adults as well. And so the idea of inclusion is very important. However, I have to say to you, it's something that is said a lot, but whether it's actually enacted is something I think that we can all do better at. Everyone can do better at it. So having your voice being heard, having a seat at the table, making sure that you are able to join in the conversation and that you're not an afterthought, as it were. Inclusion is really important for everyone, and we want to make sure that inclusion is an active part of our school communities. And in recent years, we've thought about the idea of belonging, which is kind of, if you like, an overspill from inclusion. So belonging is the idea that you are bringing your authentic self to the organisation that you work at. Now, if we go back to the word diversity, and we were talking about the idea that if we are, the power of difference, and that if we are different, it's a great thing. What's really interesting, I find, is that we want diversity to a point. Because if you want someone to truly be authentic, sometimes that's going to kind of cause a bit of a clash with your own kind of values, your own views. And sometimes we say that we want belonging, we say that we want that authentic self to be apparent. But if you don't really feel like the culture is there where you can be, what tends to happen is we don't belong, we fit in. We adapt ourselves. We're no longer authentic. We fit in. We ensure that actually we can merge into that environment that we are working in, living in, etc. But belonging means that we don't fit in, we don't adapt ourselves, we bring ourselves as we are. And as I said, with inclusion, belonging, we know that, and it's, for me, probably one of the hardest things to not identify, because we can identify belonging, but it's something that you feel. And so it's really about the conditions that we set up, the culture that we set up that encourages that sense of belonging. And it's becoming more and more important now. So while inclusion was always important, now belonging, if you like, as I say, overspill of inclusion. And it's now about really being intentional about how we set up our cultures, our working cultures, to encourage belonging. And so that isn't necessarily just about our protected characteristics. It's about the things that we do to encourage that sense of belonging. So sometimes you will see the acronym DEIB. So you can now identify these words as diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And the diagram that you can see in front of you is taken from I think the findings of some work that took place, I think, around 2022 by the then head of diversity at Adidas, and her name is Chris Burnett. I don't know if she's still working there now, but she created and she worked with some psychologists because she was talking about the idea of diversity, equity and inclusion. And she talked about the idea that if we had these three, and as you can see the Venn diagram, if we had equity, maybe an inclusion, but we didn't have diversity, what would that look like? And she talked about the same for inclusion and diversity, and then again for diversity and equity. So effectively, she talked about and was thinking about what would happen if we only have the two and we don't have the third. And she felt, and again, with the work that she was doing with these psychologists, she felt actually it was really important to recognize that when we have all three in place, that's when we get belonging. So rather than read out exactly what you can see there, because you can see that, I mean, if you're watching this later on, and I'm sure you're going to get this recording, I would encourage you to maybe press pause, and I will stop talking actually for a few seconds so you can have a really good look at it. But it's that sweet spot in the middle there, that belonging, and that descriptor there that it says an organisation that engages full potential of the individual, where innovation thrives and views, beliefs and values are integrated. And I guess ultimately that's what we're looking at when we're thinking about the intersection of diversity, equity and inclusion. Let me just stop for a few seconds just while you have a look at that diagram. And if you've never seen it before, you can find it on the internet, but I'll just let you have a look at that for a few seconds. So you can see, ultimately, when we're thinking about these three keywords there, that they are, they're big concepts. They're very big concepts. And it's understandable why sometimes we might back away from them, because actually it's almost a bit like, well, what can I do? How do I do that? How do I make this work? And as I said in my introduction, I'm a big believer in contextual kind of knowledge and contextual application, because while these are huge in your world, there are small things that you can do to promote each one. And it would depend, of course, on your school. But knowing what they are and getting maybe an understanding of that, I think is really key. So I hope as I'm progressing, there may be things that you already know and you're thinking, okay, good, I've got clarification of that. That confirms what I thought. Or it may well be that you're learning new things. And if you are learning new things, great. I really hope this is working for you. And you can start to see and start to work out how it may well be that certain things that you can implement. And if you've got a question for me, by all means, do put it into the chat. So we've gone back to the protected characteristics again in this next slide here. And so remembering that it's these 9 that we work with. And these, of course, are the 9 protected characteristics that don't change, protected by law. In schools, and interestingly, in independent schools, you don't have to follow this particular working, but I always encourage it with the schools that I work in. I always encourage them to do so, because in schools, in maintained schools, in state schools, the protected characteristics, the Equality Act is kind of approached through the public sector equality duty. And basically what it is, it's ensuring that these 9 protected characteristics are known within the school, and that they are, that young people, children and young people are aware of them. And it's not so much that you are promoting any of them, it is making sure that you recognise what they are and how they work. Really kind of preparing children and young people for adult life. So in independent schools, the PSCD is not applicable as such, but I think it's a good practice thing. It's a good practice thing to do. And it shows itself really when inspections take place, Ofsted inspections in maintained schools, they just check that, and it's usually checked through either PSHE, PSE, or PSED, depending on what you call it. And it's also sometimes checked through safeguarding as well. But what we've also got to remember is that while we've got those protected characteristics that are set and that are clear, we've also got diversity traits. So if we're talking about diversity being the power of difference, we've also got to remember that there will be diversity traits that every single one of us have, that some of them are visible and some of them are invisible. And I love this diagram that you can see here, because it is a bit like an iceberg when we're thinking about diversity traits. There will be the ones that we can see that kind of lend themselves a little and very much like what we saw when we were looking at the diagram of the protected characteristics, and some of them, that will be obvious, as you can see there, with regards to gender and age and skin color, etc. But there's a lot that we all carry that are invisible, and sometimes we can't tell, and you can see that on the slide there, and they impact the way in which we present. And I suppose one of the ones that possibly that most of you may well identify with or will recognise is, for example, the idea of, even though disability is a protected characteristic, it has many forms. And if you are neurodivergent, you are going to present as neurotypical. But it won't be until the behaviours start to show that it will become more visible. And we saw that, and again, using COVID as an example, we saw that where there were, we were all asked, weren't we, to wear masks, and that was great because we all thought, right, okay, we've got to wear them. But of course, there were some people that weren't able to for whatever reason, and so of course they had to wear, and were offered people that weren't able to wear masks because of whatever of their hidden diversity traits that indicated that they couldn't wear it. And so we had to be seen to be recognizing those people. And we also had to recognize that if we were wandering around Sainsbury's or any supermarket of your own choice there, insert name, the reality was sometimes we would see people without masks, and naturally we might be a little bit indignant. And you can see immediately where some of this stuff comes from, where sometimes we just get that whole idea of, well, that's not very fair, etc. But we have to remember that quite a number of people in the world, and the people that we interact with, have hidden diversity traits. You will have hidden diversity traits that I won't know. And unless you choose to reveal them, and that's fine, because you don't have to, but that's the reality, that these all operate alongside the things that we can see. And I think this is, again, where we get the clashes, where we get sometimes well, I don't really think that we need to do that, etc., etc. That's where it all comes from. So these, I think, are probably just as important, what we see there with the invisible diversity traits, as well as the visible ones too. So if you like, these go alongside the protected characteristics that are covered by the Equality Act. So when we start to think about, if you like, and we've covered, if you like, already the definitions and the clarity between diversity, equity, inclusion and belonging, and we've talked about visible and invisible diversity traits. Another part of, if you like, of the DEI or EDI kind of understanding is about language, and this is the stuff that sometimes trips us up. It's the stuff that sometimes we think, oh, I can't say anything. I can't possibly kind of get involved. I can't arrest or stop that conversation, because we now, and I think, again, the sensitivities that we've got with regards to derogatory and non-inclusive language is such that it's always been around. It's always been around. But what we're finding now is that the use of it is more prevalent. And of course, the biggest reason probably why derogatory and non-inclusive language, which again has always been in existence, it's not like it's new language, it's simply and utterly because of this. and for those of you if you're just listening at the moment and you can't see me, it's purely and simply, I'm holding up a mobile phone, my mobile phone. And it is the mobile phone, I think, that is our problem, because what we can do now with a mobile phone is that we can spread the derogatory and non-inclusive language faster than ever. Whereas back in the day, you might have written yourself a little note or written somebody a note and passed it on. I don't know if those of you that can remember doing that. I can remember doing that at school, writing notes to friends and things like that, and on pen and paper. Now we do it on the phone. Now we can go onto a social media site and we can write those not very nice words down and we can spread it. We can now also, where somebody might have said it to you, and people still, of course, use, verbally, it's still the most inflammatory way to kind of upset somebody, by saying it to someone's face. But of course, we can now write it down and spread it to everybody, apart from the person it's directed at. Or we can start, arguments using our social media sites, through WhatsApp, through messaging sites, and the words stay there. And that's the thing. So this is one of the problems I think that schools are really, I think, are challenged by, in a way that they always were. But now it becomes something that almost becomes bigger than what the school can do. And depending on your own setting, you will have those situations, and you'll know them because they take up an inordinate amount of time, where you are dealing with and unraveling, a bit like pulling spaghetti, trying to work out who said what, when, and how. And so just to kind of give a nice basic definition there of what derogatory and non-inclusive language is as it states on the slide there, any language that treats people unfairly, insults and excludes a person or group of persons. And so what I'm finding, and what I have found in the work that I've been doing for the last 5 years, is that this is probably one of the areas that just causes a whole heap of grief. And it definitely eliminates that sense of belonging. It really does. And it's about how we react to it. And remember, I've talked about reactions already, because this is the thing. A lot of this sometimes can feel personal, even when it's not directed at us, because what it's doing, it's challenging our own values, our own kind of positions. And it's making us work out, or how do I feel in relation to that? How do I deal with that? So for some people, they won't think it's a problem, but for some people it is. And so it's that balance of how do I work it out? How do I know what to do? So this is a problem, definitely in schools. And sometimes when we think about how we manage that, we can either manage it in a very kind of, I'm not going to say knee-jerk, but a reactive, probably is the better word to use, a reactive response, which sometimes can be excessive, because again, it's triggered, pressed buttons and made us think, right, we've got to do something about it. Or sometimes it can be that actually we don't do that much about it, because actually it's not that big a deal, it's okay, it's not so bad, I don't think it's that bad, but to somebody else it is. And so it's the balance. So I linger on this particularly because, number one, it's an interest of mine, and I've created some resources that support schools in understanding that. And it's really interesting, as I said, when we're thinking about why it causes so much kind of heartache. And I've got some ideas there for you. Also, I've mentioned some already, and as you said, not as you said, as I said, it's really interesting just to kind of unpack, what I'd said before, alongside some of these. So when we're thinking, for example, about bias, and the biases that we all have, because we all have them, it's really interesting that we have words, and maybe for dealing with an incident, and we're thinking about the different ways in which people are being dealt with, or the groups of people that maybe have started or finished that conversation or started the conversation, we will have different types of biases. Now, the thing about bias is that You're never going to get rid of your biases, and you shouldn't, in the fact simply that we're all inherently born with them. And biases are part of who we are. Biases are part of our experiences in life. They've become part of what we do. So as a result of that, to eliminate that and to get rid of it, I think is, that it's crazy. You can't. It's like saying, okay, we'll just chop off a couple of your fingers and it won't matter. No, it would matter, because it's part of who you are and how you've grown up, and it's made you who you are. But what we've got to remember about bias is that we really need to think about how we manage our biases, because we have to manage them. It's not that we get rid of them. We manage our bias. And so that's part of, as I said to you, those reactions that sometimes we get when we're having to deal with it, or maybe we're in the middle of it. We had derogatory or non-inclusive language, brought in our direction. Stereotyping is another one, and it's another type of, if you like, derogatory kind of approach that is often utilized, not just about race. It can be about anything to do with the protected characteristics, the stereotyping. I often think of it as lazy thinking, grouping people together with a couple of maybe characteristics that maybe you've seen or maybe you've heard, and you've just thought, okay, yeah, that's how they all act. So that's what's going to happen. So instead of doing the work and working it through and thinking, well, actually, let me challenge those stereotypes, that's where we sometimes get the use of derogatory and non-inclusive language being applied because of stereotyping. And having to explain that and unpack that often can come up with resistance from the persons or people that you are trying to educate the right way. Another way in which derogatory and non-inclusive language is often kind of thrown about is the fact that sometimes the lack of language, when you're not using the correct language, and it's just as disempowering as using the completely wrong language. And so if I may give an example, a good example of that would be simply, and I'm going to use race because it's an easy and quick example to use. Not that long ago, and in fact some people still do it in sort of certain generations, the idea that when you are describing somebody who has a different colour skin to you, and I'm going to use the example of me, and how I was addressed as a young child growing up in the UK in the 70s, I was often referred to as being coloured. Now, coloured was a phrase that was used in the 1970s that was considered to be more polite than black. Because I think when we used the word black, it was considered to be quite a harsh word, and interestingly considered to be more racist. So people used the word coloured because they thought it was probably a bit softer. But actually, for me, as a black woman, and as a black child as I was then, young girl, I hated it. I used to hate the word coloured. I still do. I've got a real hate is probably too strong a word, but I just didn't enjoy hearing that word and me being described as coloured, because I would think that a rainbow is coloured because it's got different colours, multiple colours, whereas I was one colour. So I've always asked people to refer to me as black, and that's fine. But some people will still use the word coloured. And if you're of a different generation where actually that thinking was prevalent, people will still do that. And I still get it from time to time. I understand why it happens. But really what we've got to do now is to ask people what the right language is. And so that bit is the hard bit, because it's hard to then say, actually, how do you want to be known? But actually, that's better than using the wrong language, which then kind of highlights the descriptor that you see there. So it's about getting the language right. And I think where we can trip up is where we get panicky about using the wrong language. So sometimes we don't use any language at all. We don't use, we don't want to offend, so we say nothing. That in itself then perpetuates the whole thing about getting it wrong. And then, of course, when we're thinking about language choices and we're thinking about, our sense of safety and belonging, if we don't use the right language, and let's talking about schools because that's where we're from. If we're using in a school, we're using language that actually isn't particularly inclusive, then actually after a while, if you can imagine that maybe you are somewhere or you are a young person and maybe you identify as LGBTQ, and you're in a school and you go to school and your peers where people are constantly using, the word gay as a slur, then what will tend to happen is after a while, if you're always hearing that and you're already going through those different dilemmas about your identity and about how you're coming out, and yet you're hearing it as a slur, after a while, you're not feeling very safe within that community, and it could lead to, children not coming to school and young people not coming to school because actually it's not a safe place to be. There is no sense of belonging for that young person. And so it's up to us as educators, as leaders, depending on whichever position you are, that we actually need to manage that. And I connect this very strongly with safeguarding because I believe that if we don't look after, if we don't make sure that our communities are safe, that's what it leads to, people not coming into school. It's a safeguarding issue, and actually we're enabling that, and actually what we're also doing is perpetuating effectively what can turn into hate crime of sorts. And we have to remember, we've just come from a summer where people have been jailed for, number one, using incorrect language, as we've seen in certain cases where people were using some really quite vile language. And that sense of community that in certain places in the UK where it kind of just disappeared. So we know that these thoughts are there, and it's not that we're going to eliminate these thoughts, but we've got to really now challenge the language that we're using. And we do that from when our children and young people are children and young people, and not adults. Because if we don't educate and try and give people the understanding of why we would need diversity, equity and inclusion to be part of our society, then we're going to get more of what we've got or what we've had, because we obviously don't want to repeat again. So just some reflections there on the use of derogatory and non-inclusive language, and this may well be an issue for you in your setting. So if it is, and you require some more support in that, then as I say, really happy to have a conversation with you. And part of that, and part of the resources I've got that I like to also talk about, is very much a nice, easy entry level way to kind of get some of that work done. Those conversations that you've had to have, or that you're going to have, which are sometimes difficult. And they're difficult simply because of some of the areas in which you're thinking, I don't quite know the best way to say this. And it could be with a colleague, it could be with a young person, or it could be with a parent. And so what I created, and this is very much based upon what I saw in schools, was the idea of creating a collection of diversity, equity and inclusion conversational prompts and scripts, giving you ideas and the best ways to approach it so that you can get it right. So Inclusio Talk is what I created. It's not particularly expensive, and it's not really about the money, really, I have to say to you, because this is a resource. It's just a really good resource that helps you and helps your school have that understanding of that common non-offensive DEI language. And that's what you want, because you're creating a culture. You're creating a culture. If it's something that you're interested in, let me know. We're coming into land now. We're coming towards the end, and so I've left some time for some questions. But I've used the word culture before, and I think this is where it starts. And it was interesting because I was delivering some training this morning, and I was talking to some head teachers this morning, and I used the phrase, when we're talking about culture, which is of course a well-bandied phrase at the moment, utilised not just in education but across the board. But we talk about the idea that, this is the culture where this type of thing happens. But people think that culture is something that sits on its own, but it's not. Culture is something that it's a collective. It's a collective way of being. And I like to use the phrase culture is how we do things around here. It's not stuff you're going to find in a handbook. It's not the stuff that you're going to see necessarily on a website, although you might well describe some of the things that you do on your website. But it's about how you are, how you be. And I think when we're thinking about culture, when we're thinking about the idea of how do we get things differently in our culture, in our settings, in our school communities, every single person plays a role in that, regardless of whether you are the head or whether you are the cleaner. It makes no difference because everyone's part of the culture. It's not one person's responsibility. It is a shared responsibility. And often when I'm first introducing this work, I talk about the idea that everyone makes a pledge, be it small or be it large. It really doesn't matter. Small is usually the best way to start. And because it's a small thing that you do, and it can be something where you can say something as small as, you know what, I'm going to find out more about a particular protected characteristic. Or it could be simply, I'm going to make sure that and you can give yourself a time frame on that. It could be a month, it could be 6 months, it could be 6 weeks, whatever it is. It's a shared responsibility, because if multiple people are doing something small, that's when you get the change in culture. That is when it happens. And sometimes we don't start doing the work because we think it's got to be this huge, dramatic, something really tangible that shows that we're doing it, the work. And to be fair, it could be actually that sometimes the work, a bit like a hidden diversity trait, has to be done on the inside before it becomes something that is outwardly seen. So if you like, my message to you as we finish now, and I take any questions, is just thinking a little bit about that shared responsibility, about maybe where you're at in your setting right now, and whether there is something that you can do, maybe with your understanding of what you've heard over the last few minutes, last 40 minutes or so, 50 minutes, whether there's something that maybe you can think about doing that will be helpful for you in moving the dial with regards to understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we've hit Q&A, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and back to Aaron.
Thank you, Audrey. That was really interesting. Equity, I think, is going to be my new buzzword tomorrow back at school. If anybody's got any questions, feel free to pop up your hand and I'll unmute you, or if you want to pop it in the chat box, you can do. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining us this evening, and thanks again to Ollie at Brightcore. The next webinar is on building resilience on the ISP on the 8th of January. If people want to sign up, that's absolutely fine, or hang around for any questions. So it's over to the floor. It's the awkward silence, isn't it? Where nobody wants to say anything.
Indeed. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Sarah. And absolutely, I think, maybe in situations sometimes it's it was said, it was understood. It was like, great, yeah. So that's I like that. I like that. Good question. And the question from Kate is, why do we aim for equity over liberation? Why do we aim for equity? I think it's just where we're at the moment, Kate. I wouldn't necessarily say that I would love liberation straight away. I mean, that's what I'd like. I think there are so many systems in place at the moment, and those systems are sustained by people who don't want them to go away, because they suit those that they serve. So when people are happy to try and challenge them, then we get the pushback. And the pushback is actually, no, we don't need that to happen. Or it's dressed in a way that probably would mean that when challenged, it looks like it's just the same type of people who are moaning as such, that they're not getting what they're getting. So I think that's possibly why we're aiming, and we have to be incremental in that, because effectively those systems aren't going anywhere. And it's, yeah, we see it in many ways and many shapes. And yeah, I won't unpack that too much now. But fundamentally, I think that's my take on it, Kate. I don't know if you have a take on that. But thank you, not at all. But that's kind of where I see it. It's a systemic thing. Big time. But thanks for your question.
Thanks, Kate. That's great. Okay, I think that might be it for questions, Audrey. Once again, as well, I forgot to mention, this is being recorded. So if you want to share this amongst colleagues in schools, you are more than welcome to. It will all be emailed out later on, probably Friday, I think it'll be all emailed out to. But thank you very much for everybody coming to the this webinar this evening. And thanks again to Audrey. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a lovely
Bye
evening, everybody.